What happens in the 60 seconds after a country attacks the most powerful military on Earth? You're about to find out second by second, because that clock started running before dawn broke over the Persian Gulf. Before we go any further, hit that like button right now, because what you're about to hear is the kind of story that deserves to be shared, not scrolled past. Subscribe if you want the next chapter of this war the moment it drops, and send this to one person who still thinks this conflict is over. It is 5:47 in the morning at Ali al-Salam Air Base in Kuwait. The sun hasn't fully risen yet. Soldiers are walking between buildings, half awake, thinking about coffee and the end of their shift. Nobody on that base knows that 90 seconds earlier, on the other side of the Gulf, Iranian missile crews pulled their triggers. 8 missiles are already in the sky. They are not creeping toward Kuwait. They are falling out of the edge of space at more than a mile per second, 5 times the speed of sound, and they are aimed directly at the people walking across that base right now. Then the alarm goes off. It is not a drill. Everyone on that base knows the difference between a drill alarm and a real one within half a second of hearing it, and this one is real. Soldiers who are walking suddenly start running. A fuel truck driver slams the brakes in the middle of the taxiway and just sits there, engine running, not sure if moving or staying still is the safer choice. 4,000 Americans go from an ordinary morning to huddling in bunkers in under 60 seconds. And here's the part that should make your stomach drop. All 4,000 of those lives now depend on a small crew of soldiers sitting inside one steel box, staring at a radar screen, with less time to react than it takes you to read this sentence out loud. That box is a Patriot missile battery, and what happens inside it over the next few minutes decides whether this becomes a story about a base that survived or a story about a tragedy that reshaped a war. Let's talk about why this moment is so brutally unfair to the people trying to stop it. A ballistic missile, once its engine burns out, cannot change direction anymore. Physics has already decided where it's going to land. It's like a stone thrown off a cliff. Once it leaves the hand, the path is fixed. That sounds like it should make defending against it easier, and in one way, it does. The radar can calculate exactly where all 8 missiles are going to hit almost the moment they're detected. But here's the cruel twist. The same physics that makes the missile's path predictable also makes its speed nearly impossible to deal with. These missiles are moving at more than 3,000 miles an hour on the way down. The radar might know exactly where all 8 are going to land, but knowing isn't the same as stopping. The crew inside that trailer has only a handful of minutes, sometimes less, to shoot down 8 falling objects with pinpoint precision, using missiles of their own that have to physically slam into targets moving faster than a rifle bullet. Imagine being told exactly where and when 8 cars are going to crash, but having only 60 seconds, and one small team to somehow stop all of them. That is the position this Patriot crew is in. Inside the trailer, the radar operator watches the launcher units check in one after another. Ready, ready, ready. The radar itself doesn't spin around like the ones you might picture at an airport. It's a flat panel that stares in one direction and steers its beam electronically, thousands of times every second, tracking multiple threats at once and guiding interceptor missiles using that same beam. Think of it as a mind trying to play 8 games of chess simultaneously, except every second wasted on one game is a second stolen from the other 7. The first missile is given a firing solution. It goes green. That's the go signal. An interceptor screams out of its launch tube on a pillar of white fire, pitches over and races north toward the incoming threat. Seconds pass that feel like hours. Then, high over the coastline, the lead Iranian missile explodes, not from hitting the ground, from getting hit directly by the interceptor. The pieces keep falling, but they're just fragments now, scattering harmlessly instead of slamming into the base as a warhead. Inside the shelters, someone lets out a ragged cheer. It's the sound of soldiers who understand in that moment that this one didn't kill anyone. That interceptor is called a PAC-3, and it doesn't work the way people usually imagine missile defense working. It doesn't blow up near the target and hope shrapnel does the job. It's built to physically collide with the incoming missile at a closing speed faster than 8 times the speed of sound. Picture 2 bullets meeting head-on in midair. That's roughly what just happened above that coastline at a cost of around $4 million for a single interceptor. Why go through all that trouble to score a direct hit instead of just exploding nearby? Because at those speeds, a near miss with fragments might only clip the fins or shred the outer casing, and the warhead could still fall on the base intact. A direct hit removes all doubt. There's nothing left of the missile to argue with gravity. 1 down, 2 down. The trailing missiles keep winking out over the water, one after another, and for a moment, it looks like this crew might pull off something close to a miracle. But the tactical officer running this fight doesn't relax, not even a little. He's been through enough close calls to know that a battle that looks too clean usually isn't finished teaching its lesson yet. And he's right. A new signal appears on the radar, low, slow, hugging the surface of the water, coming from the southeast, from a direction the main radar wasn't even watching closely because it had been staring north at the ballistic missiles the entire time. These new threats are drones, cheap, slow, flying at barely more than 100 miles an hour, each one carrying about 90 pounds of explosives in its nose. They cost a tiny fraction of what a ballistic missile costs to build, but that's exactly what makes them dangerous right now, not despite their cheapness, but because of it. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Those drones weren't launched in response to anything. They were launched hours earlier, timed with brutal precision to arrive at the exact same 60-second window as the ballistic missiles, but from a completely different direction. Somebody planned this. Somebody sat down with a map, knew exactly which way the American radar would be pointed once the missile attack started, and used that knowledge to sneak a second wave in through the back door. $50,000 worth of flying lawnmower engines and explosives, aimed at overwhelming a missile defense system worth hundreds of millions. If you're finding this story gripping, this is exactly the kind of real battlefield breakdown this channel exists for. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss what happens after this island gets marked for destruction, because what comes next is even bigger than what you've just heard. A second Patriot unit swings its radar to cover the new threat. Interceptors launch again, this time an older design, cheaper, built to hit. Slower targets like these drones using two missiles fired close together, so if the first misses, the second corrects. One drone cartwheels into the Gulf in a spray of burning debris, then another. But here's the trap the enemy built into this attack. Every second the crew spends dealing with the drone swarm from the southeast is a second their radar and their guidance channels aren't fully focused on the remaining ballistic missiles still falling from the north. The system can only track and guide so much at once. It's not a bottomless well of attention. It has limits, and whoever planned this attack knew exactly where those limits were. Two ballistic missiles are still inbound when the drone swarm arrives. The crew tries to juggle both threats at once. One interceptor connects successfully. The other launches 3 seconds late, delayed just long enough because the guidance channel it needed was busy finishing off a drone. 3 seconds. That's all it took. The tactical officer watches the final track across the last line on his screen with nothing left in the air to stop it. At 5:51 in the morning, the last missile slams into a maintenance hangar on the base. The explosion rips the roof apart and leaves a crater where machinery and workbenches used to be. One hangar. That's the final toll from this entire coordinated attack. Out of 8 ballistic missiles and a wave of drones, one target was hit, and it was empty equipment, not a barracks full of sleeping soldiers. You might be thinking that sounds like a victory, and in the narrowest sense, it was. Nobody died. Most of the missiles were destroyed in the air. But think about what this attack really represented. It wasn't really about that one hangar. It was a message. It was Iran testing whether they could reach American forces directly, whether they could put fear into a base full of soldiers who thought they were safe behind layers of expensive defense technology. And here's the twist. Nobody in Tehran seemed to fully calculate. This attack didn't scare the United States into backing off. It did the opposite. It gave the American military exactly the justification it needed to stop holding back. Because there was already a target sitting on the list, one that no ordinary bomb could touch. And now there was a reason to use the one weapon built specifically to reach it. Let's talk about where this story goes next, because this is where things get truly staggering. Roughly 500 miles southeast of that smoking hangar in Kuwait, there's an island. Most people outside the region have never even heard its name. But for the past 3 weeks, this island has been the reason global oil prices have been spiking, the reason insurance companies in London stopped covering ships trying to pass through nearby waters, the reason more than 40 massive oil tankers are sitting completely still in the water instead of delivering the fuel the world depends on. This island is defended by an anti-ship missile system so effective that it managed to put a massive hole straight through the hull of a supertanker weeks earlier. That single strike was enough to make global shipping insurers pull their coverage from this entire stretch of water within a single business day. Think about the scale of that. One missile strike, and suddenly a massive percentage of the world's oil transport routes became too dangerous to insure. For 3 weeks, this island held global energy markets hostage. It had one afternoon left before that would change forever. Fighter jets take off, screaming low across the water that hasn't seen a single oil tanker pass through it since that missile strike weeks earlier. These are F-15E Strike Eagles, two-seat fighters built for exactly this kind of mission, carrying heavy loads of precision-guided bombs. As they fly past the anchorage where dozens of tankers sit motionless, waiting for permission to move that may never come. Deck crews on those ships look up and watch the jets pass overhead. They start counting shapes under the wings. They start doing math about how much longer their cargo is going to sit there rotting in the heat. An hour and a half later, they get their answer, and it's not subtle. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the operation begins. The first wave isn't there to destroy the deepest, most protected targets. It's there to clear a path. These jets are carrying 2,000-pound satellite-guided bombs. And their job is to knock out the island's outer defenses first. Coastal gun positions, air search radar installations, anything that could interfere with what's coming next. One target after another disappears in dark brown explosions, the sound rolling across the water like distant rolling thunder. 5 minutes behind that first wave, a different kind of aircraft arrives, flying much higher, at 35,000 feet. Inside, a two-person crew runs through their final checks. Coordinates confirmed. Fuse setting locked in. The pilot holds the aircraft steady. As a single weapon releases from underneath the jet, it takes about 30 seconds to fall, adjusting its path the entire way down using small tail fins, a shape so small by the time it reaches the ground that nobody on the surface could possibly see it coming. The hillside above the entrance to the tunnel doesn't explode outward in a fireball the way you might expect. Instead, it collapses inward, almost like someone stepped on a can. That's the signature of a very specific and very rare weapon making its combat. Debut that afternoon. A 5,000-pound precision penetrator designed to punch through layers of rock and reinforced concrete before detonating deep underground. Underneath that guided tail section sits a warhead weighing over 4,000 pounds. But here's what's surprising. Only about 1,700 of those pounds are actual explosive material. The rest is solid, hardened casing, because when you're trying to punch through solid rock and concrete before you explode, raw, mass and structural toughness matter more than the size of the blast itself. A heavier, harder object moving at incredible speed digs deeper than a lighter one carrying more explosives but less punching power. Each fighter jet carries exactly one of these weapons, clamped underneath the fuselage like a single, irreplaceable spike. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Why not use America's absolute biggest bunker-busting bomb, the one built to destroy the deepest targets on the planet? The answer is almost frustrating in its simplicity. That weapon only fits on one aircraft in the entire American arsenal, and every single one of those aircraft is based more than 30 hours of flight time away from this island. That means one wave of strikes per day, at best, with targeting decisions locked in a full day before the bombs ever land. The weapon these Strike Eagles are carrying isn't quite as powerful per bomb, but it's already sitting on jets that are minutes away from a refueling tanker in the region. It means the military can strike, watch what happens, adjust their plan, and strike again, all within the same afternoon. Iran spent years building this island to withstand America's absolute biggest weapon. Instead, America brought 24 of the right weapon. If this kind of detail is pulling you in, make sure you're subscribed, because we're just getting to the part of this story where things go from impressive to almost unbelievable. Stick with me. By 1:45 in the afternoon, this entire operation has become a well-oiled machine. Jets cross the coastline, drop their bombs, and clear out heading south toward a refueling tanker waiting 80 miles offshore with its boom already extended. Nobody is circling and waiting around. Everybody keeps moving in a constant cycle, timed and coordinated down to the minute. A Strike Eagle running at full power burns through fuel fast, which means each jet gets exactly one useful pass before it needs to refuel again. Every jet takes on 10,000 pounds of fuel at the tanker, races back in at nearly 550 miles an hour, drops its bombs, and clears the area. After each strike, dust and debris need a couple of minutes to settle before the next crew can even see their target clearly. So a fresh pair of jets pushes across the coastline roughly every 7.5 minutes. 12 pairs of jets. Roughly 20 heavily fortified targets. 90 minutes total, from 1:30 until 3 o'clock. It's an assembly line stretched across the sky. And there's a brutal reason this timeline can't be compressed any further. Those same 90 minutes are exactly how long the island's remaining defenders get to try to shoot back, which is precisely why the very first wave of jets went after the island's defenses before anything else. You clear the porch before you try to walk through the front door. One particular strike element shows exactly what this constant pressure feels like from inside the cockpit. Two fighters climb to altitude and head toward the island, watching it grow from a distant smudge into a shape wrapped in smoke. The crew runs through. Their checklist quickly. Coordinates, fuse setting, release timing, wings level. Both bombs drop together and the jets are already banking away while the weapons are still falling. Behind them, two enormous columns of dirt and smoke rise from the ridgeline. One tunnel entrance sealed, then another. The crew in the back seat, watching through a targeting camera, confirms both hits in clear air before the smoke from earlier strikes rolls in and blocks the view. But here's something worth appreciating. Down among the wreckage of the coastal defenses, not everything on the island has gone silent yet. There's an Iranian radar operator stationed above the port who has apparently spent years training for exactly this kind of day. His radar equipment is still working, and the reason it's still working is discipline. He refuses to transmit at full power. Instead, he keeps his radar signal deliberately weak, almost a whisper compared to what the equipment is capable of. American sensors that hunt for enemy radar signals are looking for strong, loud transmissions. By keeping his signal faint, he stays almost invisible to that kind of detection, even though his radar picture is much less detailed as a result. He knows the approach patterns American jets tend to favor because he has studied them for years. And now, with the strikes happening on a predictable schedule, those jets are essentially flying the pattern he expected all along. He feeds rough bearing information to hidden missile crews behind the ridge and lets the timing of the American strikes bring the targets straight to him. At 2 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, a missile launches from the island on a thin trail of white smoke, and not a single warning system on any of the American jets detects it electronically. The first sign of danger comes from a pilot's own eyes. Missile in the air. One flight of jets breaks hard, twisting away from the threat. The missile detonates about 200 yards behind them, close enough that the trailing jet has to fly directly through the smoke of its own near miss. This missile came from a modern short-range air defense system, one that doesn't rely on radar at all to find its target. It uses an infrared camera to track heat, which means the jet's onboard systems, built to detect radar signals, never picked up any warning at all, because nothing was ever transmitting toward them until the missile was already in the air. Inside that missile launch vehicle, the crew was tracking the jet purely through a thermal camera, zoomed in as far as it would go, walking their aim point along an invisible line in the sky based on nothing but a rough bearing shouted over the radio. That's an incredibly difficult thing to do. Imagine being told which highway a car is on, but not which lane, while the car is moving at 90 miles an hour and you're trying to point at it through a soda straw. Every second they spent searching, the jet moved another 60 yards further away. By the time their camera locked onto the heat signature, the shot they had left was already at the very edge of what the missile could physically reach, and the jet was crossing at an angle that made hitting it even harder. It was a well-trained crew, using the right weapon, but working with an impossible amount of information. The missile missed. The launch position, however, gave itself away in the smoke of its own exhaust plume, and moments later a guided bomb destroys the vehicle before it can move. But here's the part worth remembering. That same radar operator fed targeting information to more than one missile crew before the airstrikes even started. So the fight isn't over yet. There's still at least one more launcher hidden somewhere under the smoke, and that's exactly the kind of resistance that reveals what this island was really built to survive. Let's talk about what's actually underneath this island, because this is where the real story lives. The naval force that built this island's defenses didn't rely on armor or open battlefield tactics. They relied on engineering, on hiding things deep enough underground that conventional bombs simply couldn't reach them. Analysts studying years of satellite images believe the main missile storage area sits under roughly 100 feet of deliberately placed rock and soil. On top of that natural cover, there are as many as 5 separate slabs of steel reinforced concrete, each about 6 feet thick, built to a strength roughly twice as tough as a typical highway bridge deck. Each of those slabs rests on 10 to 15 feet of compacted soil in between. Here's why that layering matters so much. A standard bunker-busting bomb can typically punch through about 6 feet of reinforced concrete in one continuous strike. Against a single slab, that's more than enough. But against 5 separate slabs, each one absorbing part of the impact, and each transition between hard concrete and soft soil nudging the bomb slightly off its straight path, that same weapon runs out of penetrating power long before it reaches anything that actually matters. The layered design isn't about being thicker than the bomb can handle in one shot. It's about making sure the bomb never travels in a straight line long enough to reach the bottom. The opening wave of airstrikes flattened more than a dozen buildings above ground and never even scratched the rooms buried underneath, and the layout underground finishes the argument. Instead of one central room, the facility is built with a single main storage chamber connected to multiple tunnels, branching outward, each one leading to its own separate blast door and exit point facing a different direction, each with its own independent ventilation system. Every room has its own way out. No single strike anywhere on the surface can seal off the entire facility at once. It's essentially a heavily fortified vault dug into a hillside with multiple separate escape routes built directly into the design. And here's the twist. That very design, built specifically to survive, is exactly what dictated how many separate strikes the American military had to plan. 28 separate aim points existed on this island because Iranian engineers built roughly 20 different ways for this facility and its weapons to keep functioning even after taking damage. The fortress designed the very strike plan now being used to dismantle it, piece by piece. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't your average war story, and there's still one target left that changes everything. Stay with me, because the ending of this operation is something you need to hear in full. At 20 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, the entire strike operation pauses. One inbound flight is holding its bombs, waiting. A tunnel entrance numbered 9 took a direct hit just 4 minutes earlier, and the weapons officer in the back seat of that jet is staring into a targeting camera trying to confirm the damage. From 4 miles up, the camera can hold perfectly steady on that one spot, even while the jet itself is bouncing through turbulence. But the picture keeps getting worse, not because of any technical failure, but because the island's own destruction is getting in the way. Fuel fires, pulverized concrete, a thickening blanket of smoke that has been building since 1:30 that afternoon, and every column of heat rising from it shows up as a bright smear across the same infrared camera trying to read the damage below. Fuel levels are dropping across the entire formation of jets circling above. Somewhere below, hidden Iranian defenders notice the pause in the bombing and understand exactly what it might mean. In a 2-person fighter jet, the roles are simple. The pilot's job is to keep both of them alive. The backseat officer's job is to make sure the mission still gets done. Right now, that backseat officer is earning his half of that responsibility. A brief gap opens in the smoke, and for a fraction of a second, the infrared camera catches a flare of white heat, the sign of a doorway still radiating warmth from whatever is happening inside. He calls for another strike immediately. It lands, and tunnel entrance 9 collapses again, this time with rock cascading down until there's nothing left resembling an entrance to even grade or evaluate. The count starts moving again. 11 sealed, then 13. At 16, entrance is down. The second missile crew that had been fed targeting information earlier finally gets its one shot at a departing flight of jets. The missile flies wide by nearly 1,000 yards, missing completely, and before the launch vehicle can even finish repositioning, a guided bomb ends it. 19 entrances sealed. Every single one closed off from the outside is effectively a locked door. One jet, one bomb, one tunnel silenced for good. By 10 minutes to 3 in the afternoon, there is exactly one target left. The central storage chamber, the single deepest, most heavily protected room on the entire island. The specific weapon assigned to destroy that chamber was tested and refined for years before it was ever used in actual combat. Engineers ran it through advanced physics simulations that treated solid concrete and steel almost like fluids under the kind of pressure only massive impacts can create. Every single simulated drop worked through the exact same brutal questions. What happens if the bomb hits even slightly off from perfectly vertical? How does the casing flex every time it crosses from hard concrete into softer soil? Can it survive deceleration forces in the tens of thousands of times the force of gravity without breaking apart or losing its fuse timing? The engineers who eventually built this weapon ran through every possible failure scenario until the design held up, then proved it worked using instrumented test concrete and live drop tests years before this island ever became a target. The people who built this underground vault were essentially guessing about what kind of bomb might eventually come for them. The people who built the bomb weren't guessing about the vault at all. They had already modeled it down to the smallest detail. At 3 minutes to 3 in the afternoon, the final flight of jets crosses the coastline while the entire island smokes beneath them. 19 tunnel entrances destroyed. One hillside still standing, right in the middle of all that destruction. The backseat officer confirms the final coordinates through a brief clearing in the smoke. The weapon releases from underneath the jet, which suddenly becomes 5,000 pounds lighter and climbs hard, turning south. Now everything comes down to a single fuse, roughly the size of a coffee can, buried inside that falling weapon. If it triggers even one layer too early, the blast never reaches the room it's meant to destroy. All that engineering, all that precision, wasted on a single miscalculated fraction of a second. At 2 minutes to 3, the final penetrator bomb buries itself straight through the roof of that central storage chamber. From 4 miles overhead, the backseat officer watches the exact point of impact through his camera. A small puff of gray dust for a fraction of a second. Then, nothing. Then, the entire hillside lifts off the ground. Inside that falling bomb, the fuse had been counting the impact of every single layer it crossed on the way down. Concrete, then soil, then concrete again. It held its detonation until all of that resistance finally gave way to open air, until it reached the one room it had been built specifically to destroy. Only then did it detonate, inside a chamber whose own 5 layers of protective roof now work completely against it, containing that blast and forcing it directly down every tunnel connected to that central room. That fuse was never simply counting down seconds, it was counting floors. The island keeps exploding for nearly an hour afterward, and here's the detail that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. None of those additional explosions came from American weapons. They were secondary detonations, stored missiles and fuel cooking off in chain reactions, triggered by that single final strike. The very last American bomb used that day cost roughly $300,000. Every single explosion that followed after it was, in every sense, on the house. Think back to where this entire story started. One base in Kuwait, one pre-dawn missile barrage, one hangar destroyed, and not a single American life lost in that opening attack. That was meant to be a warning shot, a message of strength sent across the water. Instead, it woke up a response that reduced an entire fortified island, one that had held global oil markets hostage for 3 straight weeks, to rubble and secondary explosions within a single afternoon. That's the story of how one attack, meant to send a message, ended up writing a completely different ending than anyone in Tehran could have planned for. If this story hit you the way it hit me putting it together, do one thing before you go. Hit subscribe, because this conflict is far from finished, and the next chapter is already unfolding. I'll see you in the next one.